In my previous video, I argued that the modern West is unraveling at the end of a hijacking. The modern West is a product of the hijacking of the original wisdom that was given to the cultures that eventually became the West. The original wisdom that was given to ancient Egypt, ancient Greece. All the cultures of the world were given ancient wisdom. Biblical literalism is a hijacking of certain texts that were collected up into the Bible and then taken literally. That led to the Dark Ages, the end of antiquity, serfdom, exploitation of people, the colonial project of Western Europe to exploit other people around the world and steal their God-given resources given to them by the gods, given to them by nature, however you want to phrase it, to steal the resources of others. That's what the legacy of this hijacking of the West has led to. Biblical literalists say, oh, the world belongs to Christianity, for instance. You can look this up. There's something called the Doctrine of Discovery. Go have a look at it. All the lands that are not Christian belong to us, and the people there, we can enslave them. This is what certain papal bulls that have been published have said. They can't walk that back. They can't say, well, that was erroneous. So the unraveling of the West that we see right now, the moral bankruptcy of the West, it comes from this false biblical literalism that says, oh, the whole world is ours and we can take other people's resources. That system is going to fall apart. It's going to unravel, and it's unraveling right now before our eyes. Everybody knows something's wrong, but people are lashing out in all directions to try and figure out what's wrong. I want to take a look at a clip from a very famous movie, Gone with the Wind.
Yankees can't fight and we can.
You're right. There won't even be a battle, that's what I think. They'll just turn and run every time.
One Southerner can lick 20 Yankees.
Why, we'll finish him in one battle. Gentlemen can always fight better than rattle.
Yes, gentlemen always fight better than rabble.
And what does the captain of our troop say?
Well, gentlemen, if Georgia fights, I go with her. But like my father, I hope that the Yankees will let us leave the Union in peace.
But Ashley, they've insulted us. You can't mean you don't want war.
Most of the miseries of the world were caused by wars. And when the wars were over, no one ever knew what they were about.
Why, Ashley, if it wasn't...
No, gentlemen. Mr. Butler's been up north, I hear. Don't you agree with us, Mr. Butler?
I think it's hard winning a war with words, gentlemen.
What do you mean, sir?
I mean, Mr. Hamilton, there's not a cannon factory in the whole South.
What difference does that make, sir, to a gentleman?
I'm afraid it's going to make a great deal of difference to a great many gentlemen, sir.
Are you hinting, Mr. Butler, that the Yankees can lick us?
No, I'm not hinting. I'm saying very plainly that the Yankees are better equipped than we. They've got factories, shipyards, coal mines, and a fleet to bottle up our harbors and starve us to death. All we've got is cotton and slaves and arrogance.
That's treacherous, sir. I refuse to listen to any renegade talk.
I'm sorry if the truth offends you.
Apologies aren't enough, sir. I hear you were turned out of West Point, Mr. Rhett Butler, and that you aren't received any decent family in Charleston, not even your own.
I apologize again for all my shortcomings.
In this scene, this Rhett Butler scene, the Southern gentlemen are all gathered around and they're ready to just lick the North. One Southerner can beat 20 Yankees is what they're all saying it, and Rhett Butler is quietly listening to all this, and finally they ask his opinion, and he says, I think you've got a problem. Your problem is you don't have any industrial capacity whatsoever. You don't have a single cannon factory. You don't have coal mines. You don't have the industrial capacity to fight an industrial war. And of course, he was correct. The movie was made in the 1930s. It's based on a book by Margaret Mitchell, Gone with the Wind. Rhett Butler is speaking the cold hard truth, and they don't want to hear it. But he could be speaking to the West today. This is actually very pertinent today. The West has de-industrialized. That was a deliberate Wall Street policy starting in 1971 the deindustrialization of the West, part of a way for the financial elites to make more money by deindustrializing, part of the way for Wall Street and private equity to strip mine the economy and make themselves rich at the expense of the working class of the United States and the West. This is a phenomenon that has played itself out in the United States and all across the West. A deliberate policy of deindustrialization has left the West in the exact condition that Rhett Butler is talking about in this scene. So as you listen to this scene, think about Rhett Butler saying this to the countries of the West. Now, at the end of that scene, he says, all we've got is cotton, slaves, and arrogance. Well, today you could say to the West, all we've got is Wall Street, debt slaves, and arrogance. He says it's hard to win a war with just words. The West has propaganda. They've got words. They've got the media in their pocket saying, oh yeah, we're beating Russia. No, you aren't. So I'm not the first to point this out, but the West has deindustrialized, and war is an industrial activity since the time of the Civil War. The United States is still using Abrams tanks and Patriot missiles. That's because the West has deindustrialized. I was commissioned in the Army in 1991. I went to West Point in 1987. I graduated from West Point in 1991, and I served in the Army starting in 1991, active duty as an infantry officer, and the Abrams tank was in the inventory then. The Abrams tank was rolled out in the 1980s. So Abrams tanks were already in the inventory when I got into the Army. The Patriot was already old. It was an old system when I was commissioned. The missiles that Iran sent into Israel, the Patriots weren't able to stop them. The missiles that Russia is using in the Ukraine, Patriots are unable to stop them. That's because the U.S. deindustrialized, the West deindustrialized. The United States has absolutely 0 miles of high-speed rail. China has tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail already built, operating, crisscrossing their country. The United States has 0. China has tens of thousands of miles. Just to put that in perspective, the distance from New York City to San Francisco, all the way across the United States, is about 2,900 miles. Just imagine if we had tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail in the United States. If you could hop on a high-speed rail from San Francisco to New York City, or San Francisco to Los Angeles to Atlanta. If we had tens of thousands of miles, we have 0. China has tens of thousands of miles of high-speed rail. They're able to build it very quickly, and they're not stopping. They're planning on doubling what they've got. They're just going to keep building it. The United States stopped building rail decades ago. Stopped building electric generation capacity decades ago. Stopped building dams. Now they're tearing down dams. It's a deliberate policy of deindustrialization. It's actually asset stripping. Neoliberalism and asset stripping. It's a way for oligarchs and basically financiers to get rich quickly. It's easy to get rich quickly tearing a country apart and selling off the pieces. Wall Street and the financiers have figured out it's easier to just asset strip. And so neoliberalism, which is in place in the West, is basically impoverishing everybody. That's the actual culprit. You can read economists like Professor Michael Hudson, Professor William Mitchell. They talk about neoliberalism, asset stripping, and they relate neoliberalism, it's a clunky word, but they relate it to neo-feudalism. Michael Hudson has several times explained that neoliberalism is a modern form of feudalism. This is how it relates back to biblical literalism. The biblical literalist hijacking of the West brought in the Dark Ages, feudalism, serfdom. Michael Hudson explains that neoliberalism, which is what is now happening in the West, has been happening for decades, this asset stripping, it's basically a form of neo-feudalism. William Mitchell, he has a wonderful blog. You can go through it and search it and find discussions on all kinds of topics. He relates neoliberalism to neo-fascism. He shows how neoliberalism is basically a modern form, economically, of fascism. Well, fascism is a modern form of feudalism. It's an elitism. Neoliberalism, neo-feudalism, they're all the same animal. It is related to this hijacking of the West. It's a form of modern-day feudalism, a form of modern-day fascism. Those are outgrowths of the same mentality that brought you serfdom and slavery throughout the Dark Ages. And the South that Rhett Butler was talking to, and he was saying, look, all you have is an exploitive system where you're enslaving people to have your gentlemanly, rich, oligarchical existence. You don't stand a chance against an industrialized power. And that is the situation in the West today. That's why it is unraveling, because it has chosen the path of basically a modern form of serfdom, a modern form of enslaving other people in order to take their resources, including their labor, and put them into debt. That's what makes the GDP of America look so big. The finance sector makes so much money. So Wall Street, the insurance, also connected to Wall Street, the real estate market, and the monopolies. All the tech companies, a lot of those are just making their money off of a monopoly. They're making their money off of you being able to do transactions on PayPal, and they're skimming a piece of every transaction. They basically got a monopoly granted to them. Or your Netflix subscription. All these subscriptions that you've got to do, those are basically monopoly rents. Michael Hudson explains all this. Other economists explain all this. When Rhett Butler says all we've got is cotton, slaves, and arrogance, all the West has now is the fire sector, monopolies, debt slaves, and arrogance. The Confederate States of America had no God-given right to exist. Oh, they thought they did. They based their system. They supported their unjust, inhumane, slave-driven system with references to the Bible. But they didn't have any God-given right to exist. That was all based on mistaken, fraudulent, biblical literalism. And Abraham Lincoln rightly said, no, you don't. You don't have a God-given right to exist, and you don't have a God-given right to own slaves. And that was abolished. The West today cannot fight an industrial war, and the criminals in charge of it know that they can't. That's why they use terrorism. Michael Hudson explains that too. If you cannot field an industrial army, then you can use terrorism. Terrorism is the weapon of a de-industrialized society that just uses basically propaganda. But as Rhett Butler says, you can't win a war with just words, gentlemen. And you don't have any factories to make cannons here, do you? Well, what difference does that make to a gentleman? Well, it's going to make a big difference, a great deal of difference to a whole lot of gentlemen very soon. That's the situation that's going on. To fix it, people need to understand, everybody understands something is choking us out. What is it? You've got to understand what it is. It's neoliberalism, and to fight that, you've got to read your Michael Hudson. And in particular, he talks about Lincolnism, the American system. He's got a whole book on America's protectionist takeoff, where he contrasts the system of Henry Clay and Abraham Lincoln to the exploitive British system, which is basically the British Empire taking the resources of other countries and trying to enslave people and keep them down. So you've got to understand Lincolnism. Michael Hudson explains it. Listen to Michael Hudson. And you've got to understand MMT. Professor Bill Mitchell talks about MMT. Warren Mosler talks about MMT, modern monetary theory. You've got to understand it. Because money, if you don't understand it, you can't understand anything about economics. And the bankers and the Wall Street financiers and private equity don't want you to understand it. They rail against MMT. They make fun of it. They call it magic money tree because they don't want you to understand it. MMT is critical to understanding the situation that we're in. So read Warren Mosler, listen to Michael Hudson, read Bill Mitchell, and I would also suggest read my works about why biblical literalism is completely false and wrong. And it was the hijacking of the West by biblical literalism that brought in the Dark Ages and serfdom, and the remnants of that, the modern remnants of that, is neoliberalism, neo-fascism, neo-feudalism. That's what's going on right now. That's what you're experiencing. So to understand it, you might want to understand the history of where biblical literalism took over. And I talk about it in Myth and Trauma. I talk about it in The Undying Stars. And I've got online courses that will show you, going through the stories of the Bible, that they are based on the stars beyond any doubt. Biblical literalism is a hijacking of the ancient wisdom given to every culture. And now the West, which was hijacked by this hideous biblical literalist fraud, is coming undone. It's coming undone. And Rhett Butler, what he said in that movie, listen to it again. And instead of thinking of, oh, you've got cotton slaves and arrogance, what we've got today is neoliberalism, the finance sector, the monopolies, the tech, the bloated insurance companies, including medical insurance in the United States. You've got all these monopolies. They don't produce tanks. They don't produce high-speed rail. They don't produce hypersonic missiles. Russia's got hypersonic missiles. China's got hypersonic missiles. The U.S. still hasn't been able to fly a hypersonic missile, as far as we know, successfully. That's because of this deliberate deindustrialization, neoliberalism, neo-feudalism, and it's coming apart. And so to understand it, you've got to do a little bit of homework. But that's what I feel like talking about right now. Thanks for listening.